My name is Shirley Segev, and I live in Toronto. In the living room of my parents on the table was a picture of three small children. And I used to look at them. I knew that they perished in the war in a place called Auschwitz, together with their mother, who was my father's first wife, his parents, which were my grandparents, two of my aunts, and 8 nephews. One evening, I think I was about 6, I took advantage of the fact that the 2 younger siblings that I had, a brother and a sister, were asleep. And my mother was in the kitchen doing something, and it was fairly dark and nobody else was in the house. And I asked, why did they die? Why were they killed? And my mother said, because they were Jews. Very slowly, it took her a long time to say that. And I said, am I a Jew? And she said, yes, softly. And as I looked at the picture, it struck me how much like us, my younger brother and sister, these 3 kids look like. And somehow I understood that we took their place. And I remember that I felt very guilty and bad about that. And I made a decision that I will be a Jew for them, although I didn't know what that meant, what I had to do. But I took on this mission. And I wanted to find out more about them. And I started asking my parents to tell me stories. And luckily for me, they were willing. Sunday mornings especially, my father used to read Holocaust books. We were in communist Romania and books from the West were not allowed, but Holocaust books we could read. And I used to read them with him. Not everything he allowed me to, but some. My mother also told me less, but with a sense of humor. And I loved her stories the most because of the lightness with which she told them. But now I'd like to tell you at least one story from my dad, which is longer, which always fascinated me, and I asked him to repeat it many times. So he told me that while his family was sent to Auschwitz, he managed to escape that fate because he was sent to labor camp in Ukraine near Kiev, where the work that they had to do was horrible, detonating munitions and digging canals and trenches, and they were wearing rags and they had almost no food. And he realized that basically they were going to be worked to death. So he and a few others who heard about the Jewish partisans somewhere not too far from where they were organized, and they decided to run away and join them. And they did, but got lost in the forest. And eventually he was alone. He realized he's very sick with typhus and he was dying. So he knocked on the door of a small wooden cottage of Ukrainian peasants, he thought. And that was dangerous to do because some were anti-Semitic and some were not, and you never know who. But when the door was opened, he collapsed inside. And this is the fascinating story that I want to tell you, which was a miracle. The woman that lived in that home was alone. She practically lifted him from the floor, undressed him and threw out his rags. She put water in a barrel that she had there. She was able to lift him and put him in. He was that skinny. Was a tall and strong man before. She washed him. She fed him. She put him to sleep atop a terracotta furnace that was what was heating her place. He slept for a long time, and when he woke up, she fed him and they talked. And she said that she had a son in the Russian army, and she was hoping that if something like this happened to her son, somebody would do the same for him that she was doing for my father. And also she did it because she was a Christian, she said. They became friends. For 6 weeks they talked. She built up his health. She found out for him where the direction was to find the Jewish partisan. She gave him a big parcel of food. They hugged and she sent him on his way. And indeed, he did find the Jewish partisans where she said they were, and he joined. So that's my favorite story. I'll tell you what happened later, one more story. So when he joined the Jewish partisans, again, they were given by the Russian partisans and the Russian army the most dangerous jobs, basically to detonate Nazi trains. But they did it, and they were very motivated. And eventually, they were merged with the Russian partisans, which eventually were made part of the Russian Red Army, the Communist Army. And my father was, at that point, the leader of the local partisan group in the area, or all of that in Kiev, and actually was given the title of a general in the Red Army. I know because when I was born came a congratulations for the birth of the daughter of the Red Army general. So here was the end of the war, and there were many Nazi German prisoners. And one of his superiors in the Red Army came to my father and said, "Well, I want you to know we found out all your family was killed in Auschwitz. You have nothing to go back to. And here, in the meantime, we have a job for you and your team of Jewish partisans. We have a big group of prisoners of war, Nazis, and why don't you do whatever you want with them? Take revenge. They killed your families." So there were 70,000 Germans in the forest, and my father took a look at them, and what he realized was that these were young boys sent without armament and without provisions and anything by the Nazis at the end of the war. They had not had time to take part in the war. And they also didn't seem to be very indoctrinated. They were just disoriented, hungry, tired, exhausted, without any war ideology, many of them sick. He took as his second in command a doctor from Austria, who was actually from the prisoners of war themselves. Now, he also spoke German and Russian, so that was one of the reasons, I think, that he was put in charge. And he looked around and he realized that obviously they weren't going to be let go anywhere. So my father asked the Russian army, do you need anything that can be made out of wood, such as tables, chairs, beds? And he was told, absolutely, we very much need that. And from a survey, he found out that many of the young men were actually trained in the trades, and they knew how to build things made of wood. And he said, okay, but we need some food for them. And he even said some medicines, which were very hard to come by. But the Austrian doctor said, to function, we need those. And my father got those for him. And basically, for the next 3 years, that's what they did. They built beds and all the stuff that the Russian army asked for. And my father insisted that they be treated with dignity and with respect. And that's how it was. At the end of 3 years, his superiors came and told my father the decision has made to send all of these people, the prisoners, to the mines. I knew about this from later reading. But even then, my father realized that this was death for them. They would never come out of that alive. And he insisted that they not do this. And he even mentioned the Geneva Convention for Prisoners. And in the end, his superiors had no more patience for him. And they said, well, if you love them so much, go with them. So he decided to give up. And he said, I'd like to go home. It wasn't easy to go from Russia, communist Russia, back to where he came from, which was Transylvania, which used to be part of Hungary and now was part of Romania. But they let him go, which was a miracle in itself. And he went home, but there was nothing there. What he found out was 2 other brothers of his were sent to different labor camps, and they survived. And they managed to go to Palestine. But because he was so long, 7 years in the war, because he was in head of the prisoners camp when the war was actually finished, he missed the boat. The borders to the west were closed. He didn't know that his youngest brother survived Auschwitz. He was 17 at the time he went with the family. And while the others were sent to the gas chambers, he was sent to labor, and he worked very hard. And at the end of the war, he was skin and bones, and the Allies found him, and he was sent to a hospital in Germany where he was brought back to the living. And he lived for a long time, and I knew him. Well, my father didn't know that happened. And he also managed to go from Germany to Palestine. So my father was stuck in Romania. he remarried. He married my mother and had 3 children. And he was living in the Holocaust in his head. To this day, on Passover, there's a meal, the Passover meal. We all put a beet on the plate, on that special plate, with various symbolic things that symbolize freedom. And that was because in the forests, what they were doing, they were looking for cabbages and potatoes in the soil, in the frozen soil in winter. And they calculated it was Passover evening, and all they found was some beets. So I never forget. My father died at age 56, but I haven't forgot a thing. And I put a beet myself on that plate every year. We used to read Holocaust books because those were allowed, as I mentioned. And the only time that I think I was not respectful to him, because he was an amazing father, was that after we read many, many books together, one day I got up and I threw a book in his direction and I said, "Why are you reading all these books about the Holocaust?" And he said, "Because I want to understand how man can be so cruel to man. What is it in humanity that can allow something like this to happen?" And I remember telling him, "Well, you were in it for 7 years, and if you didn't understand it until now, you never will." But I said, "I still want to read with you, but I don't think you'll understand it." So that's about some of the stories about my father. And my mother, who was younger and who was married, lost her husband. She had no children. She lost her mother, a sister, and cousins in a concentration camp called Transnistria in the Ukraine. And she was telling me of one thing that haunts me, that they were allowed to take suitcases with their stuff. She lived in a city called Chernowitz, which was in an area called Bukovina, which is part of Russia. And they were chased into the river, so Transnistria, the Dniester River. So they had to cross the river. So of course they left those suitcases that they were carrying and had to just cross the river. And the Nazis were basically shooting and killing a lot of those who were crossing the river. And she was lucky enough, with her 2 sisters and mother and father and some other cousins, to make it to the other side. And then they were put into the camp. They were living in sheds, enclosed. And she survived because they were allowed to go to the local Ukrainian people and do some work. She used to sew a coat during 7 days in the home of an Ukrainian peasant. And for this, she said, at the end of the 7 days, the Ukrainian homeowner would open the floor, a special opening in the floor, and give her a bread, which usually was a little moldy. And her comment when she told me was, well, it was probably healthy. It had antibiotic because mold is antibiotic. So with that one bread, they survived a week, maybe. She was the most courageous in the family. She was the eldest of those who were there. And she used to run and steal some wood, which they were not allowed to bring to the sheds where they lived, and to light fires in the forest. And of course, they foraged for food. And many were died of typhus or hunger. They were sent on forced marches, in which many of them died. Some survived. She was very courageous. She ran over a bridge where trains used to cross to get out of the camp at night so that she could get something on the other side. They had a little bit of money, so she bought some medicine even, and even some food. And one time she knew that if a train came while she is crossing the bridge, she would fall into the Dniester, and that was it. But she was in that situation once, but she held on to the bridge for life, and she managed to survive. The train passed. And she basically worked very hard to help the family as much as she could, because younger women were usually taken into prostitution, and the idea was to hide her younger sisters that were in her early 20s, one was less than 20, so that nobody ever sees them in the shed, and to make them look like they were old. So she never exposed them. But she herself was 28 about only, but she was the eldest. So she did everything she could. And there were many of the marches, as I mentioned, and there were women with children, and she had no children. So she used to take 2 children to carry them from mothers that had 3. And that's how some survived. Some of the kids survived the war, and there was a lot of gratitude to her for doing that. There was one instant that I even couldn't believe, but I know she wasn't lying. I don't know how she did that. So she had a cousin who was a nuclear engineering, he was a scientist who spoke 7 languages. I don't know. He was one of Russia's most prominent scientists. And he was put in a special camp for academics or whatever but they were also living under harsh conditions. And she knew about that special camp. And she realized that he wasn't going to make it, because he was this kind of savant who wasn't living in this world. He was just a scientist living in his own world. So she went to his wife, the mother of some of the children that she carried on the death marches, and she said, "Give me whatever jewelry you have." Of course, they carried the jewelry with them in case they would need it. And her cousin, younger, gave her the jewelry. And my mother went to that special encampment and told the soldiers at the entrance that she needs to be taken to the head of the camp, to the officer who's the head of the camp. And they took her. And she took out all the jewelry she had. She put it on his desk and she said, look, you have in your camp one of the world's most prominent scientists. This is his name. If he's not going to survive here, he's not suitable for this kind of life. And you will be responsible for the death of one of the most brilliant people in science today. Please let him go. Please let him go where he can survive. And he could have had a shot, take her jewelry, and the guy did it. He absolutely did what she asked him. And he sent, and I don't remember his name, although I could find out, but I used to know his name. Now I don't. He was put in a special treatment location where he survived the war, remained in Russia as one of the nuclear fathers of the nuclear army, or it wasn't the army actually, the scientific community in Moscow. So that was incredible courage, I thought. When she went back home on the last march, they didn't even have shoes, so they were walking barefoot, those who survived. And they got back to Chernovitz, the city where they were from, and they didn't find a home, they didn't find anything. Her husband was dead, she found out. He was killed. He was taken to the Romanian army that I believe was in cahoots with the Nazi army, and died in some train bombardment. And she came back. They found nothing. But they got a telegram from Romania, from Transylvania, where she eventually went, where all the Jews went. There was a huge, it's the capital, there was a huge community center where everybody who came back from the war went to check out if somebody was left from their family to get news. So a telegram came from Cluj that the fiancé of one of her sisters survived Auschwitz. He is there. And can she come, his fiancé, so they get married? And the borders were closed. But it was possible for money to buy something. I remember the word. It was called propuska. It was a passport kind of, from Russia to Romania. And my mother went and got one for a girl that was actually sick and couldn't go. And she told her younger sister what her name was. This was, and prepared her and sent her. Of course, my young aunt forgot at the border. She was so afraid she forgot her name. My mother took the young girl that couldn't go, and she kept her for a long time with her, a long time being, I don't know, almost a year. And then she was able to buy her a passage as well to go to Romania. And both of them, so my aunt married her fiancé, and they went by boat towards Palestine, And they were part of the story which Mike talked about, the Jews that were stopped in Cyprus that didn't make it to Palestine at the beginning. So they were there. So I have a cousin that was born in Cyprus. He lives in Israel today. And the two girls became friends. And my mother, because of this experience, became a volunteer to help with other orphans, because this girl was an orphan. And what happened was there were Jewish officers in the Russian army that were working, and mostly at night, to collect orphans, Jewish orphans, and they were able to buy for them these propuskas and send them to Romania, and from Romania they were being sent to the West. So even after the second girl left, my mother used to go and help them find the orphans and take care and send them. And her mother died of typhus in the concentration camp. She said that they used to come and collect the dead every day in a what do you call it? In a horse driven carriage of some kind. And then they were interred together without anything, any markers or anything. And my grandfather, who was an Orthodox Jew, he was head of a yeshiva, which was a Jewish college, you could say, in Russia before the war. It was important to him, so they were able to not give her, which was a big crime, to give the body out. And they went and he found a young peasant who was willing, Ukrainian peasant who was willing to dig a hole in the ground in the middle of a field. The field was frozen. So that he did a burial for my grandmother Rachel, and my grandfather David, he gave his winter coat to the Ukrainian peasant for that, and he remained without the coat in the middle of the heaviest winter. But I think somehow they had a blanket, for which, again, my mother worked a long time to get a blanket in return for her sewing of clothing. And that was it. After the war, this was communist Russia. A cousin of mine was able, they went to Russia to try to find where she was buried, my grandmother Rachel, but they couldn't find, they found the field, but they couldn't find anything, and they had to give up on that. So I think for now, this is enough. Of course, I have other stories. I want to thank you for listening, and all the best to all.